Well, finally, there is snow in the state of Nebraska. Hello, everybody. Sam McEwen along with Evan Bland for the Pick Six podcast. We're here on February 13th, a Thursday, a few hours before Nebraska basketball tries to extend its winning streak to five against Maryland. And Tom Chattel not with us this week. He'll be back at, next week, maybe in March. But I want to encourage everybody to check out Tom Chattel's press box, which is on the Omaha World-Herald's website. You can get all of his thoughts and opinions about everything, Huskers and Jays and all kinds of stuff each week with Tom Chattel's press box. But Tom will be back probably next week, week after. We'll see. Once spring football gets going. Evan, baseball starts on Valentine's Day, and that's like your favorite sport. Baseball season is here. Baseball!
How can you not be romantic about baseball, Sam? That's right. In a week when like we're throwing down salt on our driveways, baseball's starting. So go figure. First big snowfall. It's a good thing this isn't the old Nebraska schedules where they're playing, you know, Peru State at home in early to mid-February. So they're hitting the road. It's fun. It's a fun time of year. This is not your grandpa's Nebraska team or your grandpa's Nebraska schedule. So man, I'm a little warmer on the inside just thinking about the change in scene coming up.
Yeah, your grandpa's Nebraska schedule was the Johnny Quick Classic back in the 80s when they go out to Fresno. What is your favorite? I'm going to ask you a question to start here, and then we're going to get into football here in a minute. Then we'll get back to baseball. What is your favorite sound as it associates with baseball? Like, what's the sound that you love hearing when you're at a baseball game?
Probably the pop of the leather. You
Yeah.
hear a good fastball come in to the catcher's glove, and you hear that pop or that thwack. And like you just know it's at a different level, right? Like I think everyone's played catch at some point, but when you hear someone do it at a high level, just that louder pop, that it's more concise. Maybe it's caught more crisply as well. Like there's just something about like high level catches that to me it's just like okay, here we go. Do you got one?
Well, it's that one. It's the exact same thing.
Okay.
And partially because in college baseball, they don't have wooden bats. And so there is that moment where if you're sitting kind of in the outfield or you're sitting in whatever down the line, and maybe you can't hear the pop, but you can hear the crack of a bat, a wooden bat.
Hmm.
And that's cool. That sound, that when you know it's really been hit, that's pretty exciting. And then I love the sound of a crowd when something unexpected, and baseball is one of the best sports for unexpected things to happen. So, a ball's tailing toward the foul line, and you don't know if the guy's going to get there, and he gets there. And the surprise and the delight of the crowd, it's something that they 7 seconds before could not have possibly predicted. Whereas in basketball, that almost never happens. 7 seconds before a great shot, you're anticipating that. In football, that doesn't often happen either. So baseball is that sport where you're like, something's going to happen today that I've never seen before or I haven't seen in a long time. I covered one game last year, man. One game, and it was South Dakota State beating Nebraska. And there was a 10-foot double. Never seen it before. Pop up, catcher couldn't find it. Ball lands probably 10 feet between, the cat app beyond home plate turns into a double. Like baseball, man. You see stuff you never expect. We will get to Nebraska baseball preview here toward the end of the Pick Six podcast. We'll talk a little College World Series and broader college baseball too. But we're going to start with football. We're going to talk a little bit about the state of the sport. The Super Bowl is over. The Eagles beat the Kansas City Chiefs decisively in a game, frankly, that was not nearly as close as the score, and I think the Eagles won by 19. And it gives us a chance just to kind of think about the game and where it's at, from preps to pros, and of course, including college. We'll talk briefly about men's and women's basketball, but look, Nebraska plays Maryland, and then they go to Northwestern. That's the men. The women play at Maryland tonight, and then they go to Illinois, and that's going to be tough. Nebraska women are in a little bit of the same rut that the men were in a couple weeks ago, and I'm not sure that I find it as likely the women can get out of that with these two road games coming up. If they're going to win one of them, I would think they would win at Illinois, but we'll see. And then we'll get back to baseball. Okay, so let's start with football. I'm sure you watched or took in at least some of the Super Bowl
Oh yeah.
on Sunday. It was one of the worst games of the year. And when I say worst, and I want to be clear that like as I'm watching it, I'm sitting there, I'm like, the Philadelphia Eagles played incredible. So it was one of the best games that I saw any football team play this year. Kansas City Chiefs played a terrible game. And it felt very lopsided. It felt like the Chiefs just didn't have a plan B. It was a very lopsided game. It was a boring game. And it felt like the Chiefs just were not in it. Like they weren't with it. Their offensive line didn't protect. Mahomes didn't have much time. He made two horrible mistakes. The Eagles didn't necessarily play great on offense, but they won the game and they dominated. And I thought to myself, like this just wasn't a good game. This was not the way you would want, the NFL season to end. It's not like the previous seasons ended. Um, the broadcast wasn't great. The analyst was not of my preference. He talked a lot about himself. I guess he can't avoid doing that, but wasn't the best called game you've ever seen from an analytical perspective. And then the game was over and it was anticlimactic and the Eagles won. So it just gives us a chance to reflect on the game and not only the Super Bowl, but just where the sport is, all the way from the preps level up to the pros, college and football in between. So as you're watching that game and you're kind of maybe reflecting on the end of what amounts to 6 months of football, what were your thoughts?
Well, I thought with the Super Bowl specifically, like it just kind of was a reminder that it was even with all the lopsidedness that you just kind of laid out and the fact that the Eagles, I mean, they didn't really need to blitz. It was the game was decided on the four-man rush and how Kansas City couldn't stop it. Like even as all that played out, you're reminded that really nobody predicted that, right? I mean, the Chiefs were a slight favorite. Most of your quote unquote expert picks were for the Chiefs. I thought the Chiefs would win. That's what we talked about on our pod recently. And so, like, I guess I appreciate the unpredictable nature of football still at the top level. And with all the analytics and all the money that goes into it, you still have a game where nobody really knows what's going to happen until it happens. You have one of the greatest quarterbacks ever in Mahomes on the one side, but hey, if the line can't block him, some of that's neutralized. So I love just the in football how matchup oriented so much of it is, and you can be really good in one area, but if your opponent, uh, it matches up better against you, then things turn differently. So, yes, the last game of the year was not a great one, but I thought it was unpredictable in its outcome. And I think the NFL in general, man, I mean, sure, you have your handful of teams that are at the top, but pick a week, pick a primetime window, and there's almost always a good game on that comes down to the last possession or into the fourth quarter. The fan bases are as passionate as they've ever been. So, like, I think when you talk about the state of the sport, like the NFL piece is as strong as it's ever been. If there's structure, there's tradition. It's the other stuff to me that is more of an interesting conversation. Certainly, what we cover at the college level, I mean, it's in a total transition phase right now. There's a lot to figure out. The high school phase, our colleague Stu Pospisil does a really good job talking about the issues going on at the high school level and what does transferring look like in private schools and how do you create a little bit more parity there. But man, I guess just in general, like one thing I appreciate about football is even after all these years, you don't know who the best quarterback is in the draft. They get that right sometimes, not all the time. Your size doesn't matter, your background doesn't matter. If you have the drive and the ability, like you pop, and we see great stories individually all the time. So. I don't know. It's a fun sport to cover because it's unpredictable. I think there are more characters in football than there are in a lot of other sports. And so it's always compelling. I mean, you look at what the top 100 broadcasts in the United States this last year, I think 92 were football games. I mean, if that doesn't speak to sort of where that sport is in the ethos of the United States right now, it's hard to say what would.
Yeah, I think relative to everything else that's going on the American sports landscape, football is more popular than ever, and it's resoundingly so because of again what you were talking about, the many, many, many millions of people that watch the game on Sunday and an incredible record there. Again, relative to what other sports are doing, in America. I think it's going well. I think that the professional game is as I see it is almost become a little bit too quarterback driven in terms of the conversations and the narratives we have around it. I do understand why. I think we've actually passed the golden era. I think we were just in it about 4 or 5 years ago when Mahomes was on his way up and Rodgers and Brady were still at sort of the peak of their powers. Brady was, I think, won a Super Bowl in 21. Rodgers, I think, was very close to the MVP in 21. I can't remember. I think Breeze was still around. So, like, that was almost like the peak of the golden era of NFL quarterbacking. I feel like we're kind of on the other side of it now. And Mahomes is obviously out front, and then you have Josh Allen. People, of course, are very excited about Jaden Daniels and what he might become with the Commanders. But like I do feel like you're almost starting to watch defenses begin to catch up to what's going on. And maybe they haven't quite caught up to what Lamar Jackson is doing because he's such an incredible runner and an efficient thrower. But you're seeing defenses starting to catch up, and it's almost like the story is going to have a little bit of a shift. And we'll see where it goes. And I guess I got a sense toward the end of the year, including in the NFL, just a sense of fatigue. That a lot of the what kept me coming back was actually Saquon Barkley. I loved watching him run the ball, and I think some part of me is still embedded in that love of like running the football and playing offensive line and defensive line and ball control and drives as opposed to one single plays or things like that. And so I really got to enjoy. I think my favorite game of the playoffs was the snow game between the Eagles and the Rams, and just watching that. And the game being played in the elements, I thought was sweet. And then the Bills and the Chiefs game was obviously very cool as well and very memorable. Felt like the sport maybe peaked on that day versus in the Super Bowl. But I do feel like the game has become very quarterback driven, and it's almost a little overexposed uh, at this point, particularly with Mahomes. But we'll see where it goes. The collegiate game, I think, is in this incredible transition where it's moving away from this bridge between preps and pros to it's just its own thing. And I would say that college football needs to get its arms around that. I absolutely felt a sense of fatigue at the end of the college season. I feel like that went on 2 weeks too long. So by the time we got to the what do you call it, the national title game, it was almost like an afterthought. It was an afterthought to the NFL playoff weekend. The two teams were there. I think it was pretty obvious who was going to win that game. Maybe it would have felt different to me if it were Ohio State and Alabama. Maybe that would have been different. Maybe it would have been like, two heavyweights fighting or something. I'm not sure, but that felt anticlimactic. And as we kind of turn the corner into, 2025, there is a sense of like the things that I'm looking forward to in the college football season going forward are the surprise stories. And those seem to be the things, for whatever reason, Evan, the sourness that revolved around Indiana and SMU being in the playoff didn't really surprise me because that's what ESPN's become. It's become sour about sports, about the teams that they don't support or whatever. It feels like they're very sour about it. But it did surprise me a little. Like, here's this great story of this team that nobody expected to be there. Then they're there, and then everybody's mad that they were there. And it does feel like the sport continues to get into this place of like branding and we get caught up in the brands and not necessarily in the teams and the stories. And I do wonder if football is increasingly getting stratified at the collegiate level. And people can say, well, it was always stratified, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is, in the 1980s and the 1990s, it actually wasn't that stratified. People will say that, but if you look at the number of different teams that won national championships in the 80s and the kinds of teams that won them in the 90s, there were fewer teams that won, but the kinds of football that those teams played, increasingly the teams that win national championships are kind of all doing the same thing. Michigan was a little bit of an outlier in the way that they played football there for a couple of years, but a lot of the other teams are playing out of the shotgun with, the same kind of run concepts, throwing the same kind of five-star wide receivers, using the same 3 to 4 man line defenses that are doing kind of the same things. And I know it's not universally the same, but it feels like it. And that's something that I feel like as the sport continues to stratify, the level of what do you want to call it, variety is gone. And then we see it at the high school level, where even in the state of Nebraska, where the best teams are all kind of doing the same thing. Like you can't, it's hard to win, it's hard to run the triple option and win a state title. And that actually to me is too bad because like it shouldn't be about, well, this kid isn't going to be the next Josh Allen, but he might be, and like all that. So like I feel like the sport is in a good place, but I also feel like this season provided a little bit of a warning of like the teams, just a little bit. And the Eagles might have actually helped it, but the way that game played out felt very like it's almost like Kansas City was only going to win one way, and once they weren't able to do it, their guys didn't block. It was weird.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add about the college game, Sam, is like it seems to me like the 4-team CFP era has made this feel like it's more wide open now in the 12-teamer, where it was always Clemson, it was always Alabama, it was always Ohio State, Georgia, and then maybe some team snuck in and got blitzed in the first round or the semis. Like that's so like I think a lot of people, and I would include myself in this, where it feels like more teams at least had a chance. Where SMU did get in, and okay, they didn't win, but Indiana got in, and so like in theory, it's like the wild card now in football. You get in, if you get hot, who knows how it'll happen. We'll see how it plays out over the course of the years to come. But I guess the flip side of that is Ohio State's story, which is like if you're a juggernaut team, suddenly you get a couple mulligans, and you can still get in, and you can still roll all the way to the championship. So, it's changing how we perceive things. I think especially if you were, an Ohio State or Michigan fan, under the old format, like the way that game played out, they may have fired Ryan Day because of the result. But instead, there was a chance at redemption. They still get in, they still win the thing. So I don't know. I think you need a sport where more teams and fan bases feel like they have a shot in college. And that number a few years ago was maybe 4 or 5 teams. Maybe that number now is, I don't know, 7 or 8. But maybe what Indiana showed us is that if if you get the right players to pop, if things go well in the portal, and if you're willing to invest financially, you're at the table. Like you're playing a high stakes game of poker. Who has the buy-in? Are you going to buy in? And then you have a chance. So we'll see how it goes. I think Nebraska is a team that buys in. They're bellied up to that poker table. They want to play. So maybe they have a better chance of being in the mix than they did a few years ago just because of resources and support alone.
Perhaps. I think the level of excellence that Nebraska has to reach in order to be where Ohio State and Penn State are is rooted in consistency. Like they stood toe to toe with Ohio State for 3 hours on a football field and tipped the cap. What they were not able to do was then come back the next week and play that level of football against UCLA at home to clinch a bowl berth. They came out and they didn't play very well and then lost. And that was probably the first game in the rule era where I felt like looking around, yeah, I wonder about this. That was the first time. I was like, yeah, and I went down before the game and saw UCLA's players. And I'm like, I don't know. Brass is going to struggle because of the size and the length of their receivers and their defensive backs. But then to watch the game, you're like, yeah, I don't know. I wonder. And so what he did after that game within 2 days, as we well know, is it completely changed within, a couple of days. Well, we're bringing Dana Holgorsen in. Like he knew. And to his distinct credit, he knew that what had happened in that UCLA game was different than it wasn't different, unfortunately, than what happened at Michigan State the year before, but it was at a different point in his tenure, and he could not let that stand. Like they couldn't go 5 more games with Satterfield calling the plays and risk the potential of not making a bowl because he couldn't get that group going. And he wasn't meshing perfectly with Dylan Raiola's skill set. Um, so that part of it I appreciated, but I think they've got to get to a level that's just really, really high. The one thing that I would say is that when you have a 12-team playoff, you're right in the sense that it brings more teams into the fold, but I don't think it's going to change that the most talented teams win because now you're basically saying, well, if you got to win 4 games once you get into the playoff, or at least 3, maybe 4, to win the thing, it's going to be very, very hard for a team to win 4 games if they're in that spot, if they're in Indiana spot. I mean, I thought maybe Indiana could beat Notre Dame, but I didn't think they would then go beat Georgia. I didn't think that. So um, back in the 70s and the 80s, more in the 80s than the 70s, a magical season could cap off with an undefeated season, and you won the national title based on having a perfect season. BYU did that. Other teams did too. West Virginia played for a national championship in '88. Notre Dame obviously won that game, but West Virginia got the chance to play for it. Things like that. And that's just less likely to happen now. Like the teams that are going to win are going to be the teams that make it, that also have a ton of talent. And sometimes that's not always the most fun way to do it. I don't mind NIL. I really don't. Like the revenue sharing thing and the NIL, I don't think that's a bad thing
Why not?
because I do think it actually diffuses the talent a little bit
Yeah.
because it's hard to make a case to a kid, hey, you're a 5-star, you'll play in a couple of years, and don't worry, we'll get you to the NFL, but you're going to have to forego, 4 to $7 million before that. No, I think
True.
I'll go ahead and get the money. That's okay with you, Georgia. I'll
Yeah.
go get the money. Is that all right? And what's Georgia going to say? Nothing. So that part of it doesn't matter. I don't love the portal. I don't love where the portal's at. I think the portal thing's got to be addressed and resolved. And the idea that a guy can play for 4 teams in 4 years is probably not the way you want to go. Maybe you get one free move, and then after that, you got to sit out, things like that. But
Hmm.
we'll see where it goes. I think in high school football, certainly what's happened is you get these super teams, and you got to figure out a way to resolve that. Um, because I don't know that that's the best developmental model for a number of kids. I just don't know. And the other question that you have is how many high school kids are going to get recruited 5 years from now? We still are at a point where high school kids are preferred, obviously, but the way that the portal's working, you're going to start putting kids in positions to go to FCS schools, and then they have to earn their way a call up or something like that.
Hmm.
I just don't think.
Oh yeah, FCS is going to be the new junior college.
Right.
You have a good season, you move up. I push back on the the portal piece too because of how transactional college football has become. Like it's an interesting dichotomy to me because I think on the field it's the sport's as compelling as it's ever been. Like you mentioned, it diffuses the talent. You're seeing surprise teams pop up because of it. But the off season, man, I mean, it's exhausting if you're trying to follow as a fan. Guys coming and guys going. Why are they leaving? Is it for playing time? Is it for a money grab, whatever it might be? And like, I have a son who's in second grade and he watches the games and he asks like, "Hey, is so and so coming back next year? Is Dante Dowdell coming back next year?" I said, "No, he's not." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, he's gonna go make some more money somewhere else." And like, I think that's tough as a fan when you want to get to know players over the course of multiple seasons, and they're just kind of in and out. And so like, I don't know. If I'm a fan, it's hard for me to fully buy in if these guys are here for different reasons. So I think that part's interesting. Like O'Shawn Mathis just won a Super Bowl ring with the Eagles. Do Nebraska fans claim that? Like as a Husker getting a ring, he was there for 1 year. After he spent 4 years at TCU, and he came, made some money, and got a couple sacks in Lincoln. Like, how do you sort of process that versus some of these guys from the 80s and the 90s who were there for the journey and people got to know them. Like I think that part, the relatability part of college football continues to change where it used to be, yeah, these guys are college kids like me. Maybe they got a scholarship, but they live in the dorms and they work hard and they're trying to get a degree. And now you're making six figures, seven figures, whatever it might be. I just think it's fascinating to follow sort of the relationship between player and fan as we move forward. I'm not sure it's in a better place than it was.
Right. Is Adrian Martinez a Nebraska quarterback or a Kansas State quarterback? Well, when you go to his, like, if he were to be in the NFL, I think it'd say Kansas State. I mean, nobody associates it that way, but that's what it says because that was the last school he was at. And I think O'Shawn Mathis, the last school he was at was Nebraska. The reality is he was mostly a TCU player.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. We'll continue to have this conversation. I mean, I feel I'm coming off a Super Bowl that was really not very exciting, so that may be part of it. I think the game is in a good place, certainly relative to where everyone else is at in sports, but I think there's also things that need to spruce up a little bit. It was a fun college football season, but I felt like it peaked to me on New Year's Day or something. Like it just wasn't. After that, it got a little, or maybe it peaked in the semis. It probably peaked in the semis. And then you got to that final game, which was like 13 days later or 10 days later. And it's just like, I'm just worn out by college football. So hopefully they figure it out. All right. Briefly on Nebraska men's basketball and women's basketball, as we said before, the men play Maryland tonight. Then they go to Northwestern on Sunday. That Northwestern game is a trap game. I know Northwestern's got somebody hurt. Most people couldn't tell you who that player is, which tells you everything you need to know about Northwestern basketball. The reality is Nebraska will be fortunate to beat Northwestern at Northwestern because they don't play that well when they go to Northwestern. And it doesn't matter that Brooks Barnheiser, who I think is the guy that's hurt, is hurt. Most people couldn't tell you who he is anyway among the Nebraska fan base. I'm not trying to disparage the Nebraska basketball fans, but that's the reality. Northwestern puts out a very specific kind of product, doesn't necessarily require a given player to execute. Northwestern will be hard to beat. Tonight they play Maryland. I think they're going to beat Maryland, even though Maryland is a more talented team than Northwestern, because the game is in PBA, and they will give Maryland a hard time. So we will see what happens there. And then the women play at Maryland tonight, and then at Illinois Sunday. They've actually beaten Maryland several times in the last several years. They have figured out Maryland's style, but Maryland has some pretty talented players. And then Illinois, we'll just see. I feel like that's kind of an NCAA tournament game kind of deal for Nebraska, and they'll have to bring their best. They're in a little bit of a rut shooting the basketball.